hit record. And turn off my sound on my phone. Okay. All right. Is everyone ready?
I'm ready.
Jay is not ready. Oh. I'm going to see how that microphone works. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Everyone's here today, even Cody, to another episode of Halfway Podcast. In the middle of a real bad times in America, but this episode is not about that. Who knows? By the time it comes out, maybe everything will be fixed.
So, are you trying to say that this episode's going to be a happy, positive, optimistic story? Please say yes.
We'll see. No, not really. It's dark history. It's not happy history. You know.
Yeah, but we're living in dark times. Let's just go to
positive. That would just be history.
This is a dark history podcast.
Yeah.
I'm gonna hang up. I can't handle it. There's too much negativity. I'm ready.
Are you though? Okay.
I'm so ready.
So, for more than 2 decades in the 20th century, a horrifying procedure was used to, quote, treat mental illness. In the procedure, most of the connections to and from the prefrontal cortex are severed. This is something we now view as medical barbarism and a trampling of patients' rights, but for a while, it was not only all they had to try, it was fairly popular. Today, we're talking lobotomy. Dun, 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 dun. Cody, what do you know about lobotomy?
I've heard it a million times, and I've never thought about it as being dark.
Oh, it's pretty dark.
I feel like I've only seen it in cartoons.
Oh,
it's bad.
It's not that great.
I think they used to, at one point, I thought I think they experimented with just like taking people's teeth out, like all their teeth, and that would somehow cure them.
Yeah.
I mean, they've done a lot of things for sure. I'm just interested to see it. Part of me wants to find a video of someone who's been lobotomized. Will you just instantly die?
No,
or do you live?
You live, I guess.
Oh yeah.
You're just like a skin.
They've got a daughter that was lobotomized.
Yeah, I think she's still alive.
She's still.
Oh my gosh.
Alive? She's got to be like 90 by now.
Maybe she's not alive. Who knows?
Well, maybe that's the cure to live in old age.
Yeah, that's the cure to live in old age. You heard it here first, folks.
Lobotomize yourself.
Yeah.
But basically what happened was the Kennedys had a daughter who was a little bit like slower. It's like JFK's sister. And so they lobotomized her, thinking at the time that it would fix her. And then obviously it made everything worse. So they just like abandoned her into a psych ward and like acted like she never existed after that.
Hell yeah. That's what you do.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to tell you some of the history before lobotomy, what lobotomy is, and what happened, a little bit of what happens to folks who've had this done to them. There's a guy who tried to make it very popular in the U.S. U.S. is not the only place that they were doing it. So a little bit of background. For millennia, humans have practiced something called trepanation, which is drilling little holes into skulls. The ancient peoples didn't know a whole lot of specifics about the human body, health, definitely not germs and viruses, so they had lots of ideas about like spirits. Even in the couple recent centuries, they had ideas about humors and bile in the body. So they probably drilled these little holes in people's skulls to treat various ailments like head injuries, which isn't a bad idea if you have to relieve pressure on someone's brain from hemorrhaging. Not the worst thing to do. But there's worse things you could do. And other than the infections, they sometimes didn't know how to deal with. It was likely used to treat pain as well. So there have been myriad religions throughout human history, and just as many ideas about what upsets the gods or nature. Ideas like bleeding, just letting people bleed, and maybe the bad stuff will come out. Sacrificing humans to appease the gods and whatnot. So some scientists believe that trepanation anciently was used to pull evil spirits from the body in rituals as well. Archaeologists found about 1,500 skulls, so like 10% of all the skulls that they found from the Neolithic period throughout the world that have these holes in them. So it's a little bit more than a blip on the radar. It's fairly widespread. Of the skulls we found, 10% of them have holes drilled into them.
And it was around the temples, right? If I remember correctly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. It's a fairly intense thing to do if you don't have to do it to save someone's life, especially in periods where people could die from a paper cut and they didn't have any ideas about what made us sick. That trepanation is not exactly the thing that we'll talk about today, but drilling holes into people's heads isn't new and not particularly far-fetched. It's been around a long time. Okay, so there's a man named Phineas Gage who worked for the railroad. September 13th, 1848, Phineas Gage was a 25-year-old railroad worker and blast foreman. He was directing a work gang blasting rock while prepping the roadbed for the Rutland and Burlington Railroad in an area in Vermont. When you have big rock formations in the way, you just fill that shit with dynamite and blow it up. Problem solved. So that's what they were doing. Make way for this railroad. We don't want to have to go up mountains with a train, so blow the rocks in the mountains up. Seems a little dangerous to do. And it was. So they had to bore a hole deep into this rock formation, add some blasting powder, add a fuse, tamp it down with an iron tool to contain the blast energy and try to direct it into the rock. So the rock explodes and not as much comes out of that hole. So the tamping iron that Phineas Gage, he had it like specially commissioned, custom made to use in setting explosive charges, which was his job. He was described by his various railroad employers as, quote, a most efficient and capable foreman, a shrewd, smart businessman, very energetic, and persistent in executing all his plans of operation. So that's what Phineas was up to about 4:30 p.m. He got distracted, looked over his shoulder, and unintentionally brought his head in line with the blast hole. He started to speak, and in that moment, the iron tool he was using to tamp down the powder sparked against the rock, and the powder exploded. The tamping iron was rocketed from the hole it was in. It was 1.25 inches in diameter, 3 feet 7 inches long, and weighed 13.25 pounds. It entered the left side of Phineas's face in an upward direction just forward of the angle of the lower jaw. It continued up outside the upper jaw, fractured the cheekbone, passed behind the left eye through the left frontal lobe, then completely out of the top of the skull through the frontal bone. It went clear through his skull and out the other side, landing 80 feet away, quote, smeared with blood and brain.
Fuck.
He didn't die, surprisingly. Phineas, he got knocked onto his back, had some brief convulsions, but spoke within a few minutes, walked fairly well, and sat upright in an ox cart for the 3/4 mile ride to where he was staying in town. The railroad had an accident doctor, a special doctor who dealt with accidents. And he wrote, when I drove up, Phineas said, "Doctor, here's business enough for you." The doctor says, I first noticed the wound upon the head before I alighted from my carriage, the pulsations of the brain being very distinct. The top of the head appeared somewhat like an inverted funnel, as if some wedge-shaped body had passed from below upward. Mr. Gage, during the time I was examining his wound, was relating the manner in which he was injured to bystanders. I didn't believe Mr. Gage's statement at the time, but thought he was deceived. Mr. Gage persisted in saying that the bar went through his head. Mr. Gage got up and vomited. The effort of vomiting pressed out about half a teacupful of the brain through the exit hole at the top of the skull, which fell upon the floor.
Nice,
No, you didn't need that.
There's another guy, doctor for the town. Town doctor John Martin Harlow described Gage as, quote, a perfectly healthy, strong, and active young man, 25 years of age, 5'6" in height, average weight of 150 pounds, possessing an iron will as well as an iron frame, having had scarcely a day's illness from his childhood to the date of his injury. Both of these doctors shaved the scalp region where the bar had exited, removed the coagulated blood, small bone fragments, and, quote, 1 ounce or more of protruding brain. They closed the wound with adhesive straps, leaving it partially open for drainage. They bandaged the entrance wound on his jaw, loosely for the same reason, applied a wet compress, then a nightcap, then bandaged even more. Gage's face and forearms had been pretty badly burned, so the doctors bandaged and dressed those wounds and ordered Gage's head to be kept elevated. His recovery was long, difficult, and uneven. The morning after the accident, he recognized his mother and uncle who'd been summoned from New Hampshire, where they lived 30 miles away. But the second day, he became delirious. By the fourth day, he was described as rational again and recognized his friends from the railroad.
Good.
12 days after the accident, he was semi-comatose, and the 13th day, the coma deepened. By the 14th day, everyone expected him to die. He was comatose, he wouldn't eat unless basically forced, he didn't want to speak, and when he did, it was monosyllabic. Dr. Harlow sprung into action, cut out the infected tissue around the top of Gage's skull that was filling the opening, used a scalpel to open the wound, and found 8 ounces of pus and blood that poured out. Ultimately,
Nice.
the doctor, having known to do this, saved his life. 10 days later, on the 24th day after the accident, Gage was able to sit up and took a step toward his chair. A month later, he was walking up and down stairs around the house. Over the next several months, he gradually got better. He's able to return to his parents' home in New Hampshire. By February, he's able to do a little work with the horses in the barn, feed the cattle. About May, he was able to do half a day's work plowing in the fields. The previous month in April, he'd had a follow-up with Dr. Harlow, and by then he had total loss of vision in his left eye and partial paralysis of the left side of his face. After the accident, Phineas lived another 12 years, but on May 18, 1860, he had a severe convulsion, and the seizures continued throughout the night and over the next couple of days. He died late on May 21st, 1860. The reason this case is important is it spurred an entire field of research into the specific functioning of different parts of the brain. People hadn't seen this happen before. Someone get a traumatic brain injury, something spiked through their skull, and lived to tell about it. They wanted to study how this could relate to clinical pathology of psychiatric diseases, behavioral problems and issues, and myriad other mental illnesses. This guy who got blown up in a work accident and lived to tell the tale helped bring us to what we'll talk about today. Jumping forward
Good
a
for
couple,
him,
yeah,
though, for living that long.
yeah,
Like I would have died instantly. It sounded like a vacation for a little bit, just like a coma for a few days.
yeah, and then a
Sometimes
real
I
hard
wish.
road to recovery thereafter.
Mm-hmm.
Jumping forward a couple decades to the early 20th century, we know about, in psychiatry, psychology, we know about mental illnesses, and they have a name at this point. Depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, but there's not really much of anything anyone can do about it that actually helps. There's no drugs yet. There's no treatments yet. And like around this time, people are starting to talk about how great eugenics was, leading toward World War II a decade later. So that's a tale for a different day. But with the thousands of people suffering from mild to severe mental illness and nothing to do about it, folks started getting a little creative and a bit radical.
Hell yeah, dude. Humans.
Hell yeah, get them. Some of the new radical techniques they tried in the 30s were basically attempts to shock patients into recovery. They would do things like alternate punching someone in the head or hitting someone on the head and then submerging them in water, and that's their treatment. And maybe that'll shock them into not being schizophrenic anymore. They would do hydrotherapy, so they immobilize the patient in a freezing bath, thinking maybe the brain just needs to be snapped out of it. Maybe the behavior is something wrong with the body. The body just needs a big shock to break free of it. A man named Manfred Sakel, a psychiatrist from Hungary, devised a new treatment in 1934 to apply to schizophrenic patients. Schizophrenia, for anyone listening who's not familiar, it's not just hearing voices. Symptoms can include delusions, hallucinations, trouble with thinking and concentration. Can be characterized by episodes where the patient's unable to distinguish between real and unreal experiences, basically. Can be hearing voices as well, part of the hallucinations. Dr. Sakel had an idea. Let's try this. Insulin coma therapy, wherein patients would be injected with near fatal levels of insulin repeatedly, leaving them unconscious for days on end. He claimed that 88% of his schizophrenic patients improved with this dangerous treatment, which nobody really believed then or now.
Right.
Oh, darn it.
You know what I love about humans is we go through like these phases of either religious or scientific times in which we are completely willing to sacrifice other humans for the whatever, you
Yeah.
know?
Definitely. Even so, 100 American hospitals eventually built insulin therapy units. These wards were described as quiet, eerie, with rows of comatose patients in beds, attended by staff trying to keep them from dying of hypoglycemia, which is what will happen if you shoot them up with insulin. After that, a convulsive therapy was introduced using a drug called metrazole, similar to camphor. Camphor is a powder Originally came from the bark and wood of the camphor tree. It's a common ingredient in remedies applied to the skin for cough and skin irritation. You're not supposed to ingest it, but that's what it was used for. Metrazole was initially created as a circulatory and respiratory stimulant. In 1934, Ladislas Meduna became the first to use metrazole intravenously on schizophrenic patients after deciding that convulsions produced by epilepsy seemed to help these patients recover their mental health. So give somebody a seizure or enough seizures, maybe they won't be schizophrenic anymore, was his idea. So he used a drug to do it. He moved to America from Hungary, and many psych hospitals adopted his therapy through the early 1940s. The gigantic drawback was the intense fear and anxiety it produced in patients just before the seizure started. You'd have to hold them down really hard, which is not a thing to do. These treatments, and what we'll talk about in a moment, were brutal to watch, horrendous to endure, but they did present an alternative to indefinite confinement in mental hospitals. The new treatments didn't cure many people, but held out the chance for a cure and gave mental hospital staff something to do for psychotic patients rather than putting them in padded cells and straitjackets, which is not to say these were good techniques to try and do. When you're at the end of your rope, you might try anything, as crazy as it sounds.
One fascinating thing about especially American psychology during this period is its willingness to embrace these different European ideas. And one very specific thing I can think of is when Freud came to the United States.
Yeah.
He only came like once or twice because he fucking hated the United States and he thought Americans were retarded. But before that, he had gotten jaw cancer. And so most of his jaw was removed. So he didn't really like to talk and stuff like that. So it physically hurt him to speak a lot. And so American psychologists actually thought that he was being quiet as a way to listen. So that's where this American psychology adopted this idea of being quiet for long periods of times. But it was actually just because Freud hated Americans and didn't like to talk to them.
Love it. Good job, Freud. He had some interesting ideas. Maybe someday we'll talk about his.
Yeah.
So let's talk about lobotomy. Lobotomy is an umbrella term for a bunch of different kinds of operations. It's not all the same, like the ice pick thing that we'll talk about. All ultimately did the same thing. Damage brain tissue on purpose to treat mental illness. Try to make people better if you can't. Doctors were trying to fix behaviors this way, and they knew a little bit about the brain. They didn't really know necessarily what parts of the brain controlled what in the body fully, but they knew a little bit. So they figured these behaviors were set down in neurological connections, and if you could damage the connections, you could stop the bad behaviors. Again, the big problem was there was no good ways to treat mental illness when lobotomy came around. They just really could lock folks up, put them in a straitjacket in a padded room, make sure they eat and drink until they die. There were hundreds of thousands of people locked up in mental hospitals this way, and for these and sometimes very little reason. They didn't have, like I said, treatments for or drugs for schizophrenia or depression or anxiety. So that's just all of that is backdrop to part of why they decided let's mash up some brains. In 1935, a Portuguese neurologist named Antonio Moniz created a brain operation he called leucotomy at a hospital in Lisbon. It involved drilling several holes in his patients' skulls to access the brain and was the first mentioned leucotomy to treat mental illness. They would do this for other things, hemorrhaging, pressure on the brain, stuff like that. But to treat mental illness, he was the first one to do it, the first one credited to do it. And for doing this, he wasn't actually the neurosurgeon that did it. He just came up with the idea. He received the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1949, which was not only a controversial treatment, but a controversial award. The medical community was none too happy that he received the Nobel Prize, by and large. Moniz and his colleague Almeida Lima, who was the actual neurosurgeon, targeted the frontal lobes because they're associated with behavior and personality. He thought that cutting neural connections again in the prefrontal lobe was disrupting detrimental emotional responses that had just become habits for people who, through the course of their mental disease. So they developed these bad habits because of their disease. Let's cut up the brain and maybe they'll develop new ones. His new procedure, leucotomy, would force brains to develop new neural pathways and more beneficial emotional responses, he thought. So basically, he drilled holes in their heads, used a needle-like tool with a retractable wire loop. The needle part let the wire travel through the posterior of the frontal lobe, cutting through the white matter fibers of the brain. So literally cutting up the brain and the neural pathways. Moniz reported the treatments as a success. It could treat patients with depression, schizophrenia, panic disorder, and mania. He said his first 20 patients had dramatic improvements, which would be super great if it did in fact work and didn't make things worse. Except often it did make things worse. Moniz and Lima in particular, the first to do it, but not the last by far, kept poor records of patient follow-up and even had returned some patients to asylums post-operatively, never to be seen again, which is not great medicine. These operations had severe side effects: increased temperature, so fever, vomiting, bladder and bowel incontinence, eye problems, apathy, lethargy, abnormal sensations of hunger, and on and on. It wasn't good. People didn't fare well after these initial procedures.
There's a reason why peer review is a thing now.
Yeah. The medical community was, from the beginning, fairly critical of this procedure, but even so, doctors around the world started using it anyway. It became a popular thing to do in the absence of any other options. The first procedures involved cutting a hole in the skull or multiple holes and injecting ethyl alcohol into the brain to destroy brain fibers that connected the frontal lobe to other parts of the brain. So cutting open your skull and pouring ethyl alcohol inside doesn't seem great. Not the best of ideas. No conversation about leucotomy or lobotomy would be complete without the, I guess you could say, the father of lobotomy in the U.S. The first man to do it here and arguably popularize it, or try to popularize it here anyway. Alice Hamat, a lady, 63-year-old lady, was a housewife who'd suffered from debilitating insomnia, anxiety, and depression. Emotional problems and nervous breakdowns had been plaguing her most of her life, so typically she'd just be institutionalized in a mental hospital if her husband got tired of her, didn't want to deal with her. Even if she didn't have those problems, if he got tired of her and said she was mental, she'd be sent there for the rest of her life. But Alice was given another option in September 1936. Walter Freeman and his neurosurgeon partner, James Watts, accomplished the first attempt in American medical history to treat a psychiatric disorder by performing surgery on the frontal lobes of the brain, and Alice Hamat received the first lobotomy in the United States. They weren't doing the ice pick thing yet.
Did it work really well?
Let me tell you a little bit about Alice. She was born the youngest daughter of pioneer settlers, so that's cool. She'd had her troubles with anxiety and emotional outbursts as a child. In her mid-20s, she married Theodore Hamat, who was an even-keeled man who worked for the Kansas State Department of Agriculture. His job and promotions moved him around a bit. She was already having issues, and then in 1933, there was a murder-suicide of her sister and brother-in-law, which didn't help her emotional state. She is described as sometimes she would grimace at herself in a mirror, pee on the floor, and stand nude at the windows, exposing herself to the neighborhood.
She was just a child.
We've all done like two of the three of those things.
Yeah, but only when you do all three do you get a lobotomy, okay?
Yeah. For 10 years, Alice had used strong bromide sedatives to help her sleep. She regularly had suicidal ideation. All of these are mental illness things that we know something that you can do with now, but they had no clue at the time. Except lock her up. They didn't have treatments. They were still using phrases like shell shock and coward to describe PTSD soldiers would suffer in war. So when Alice came to Walter Freeman, after Walter had researched Moniz's methods and practiced on the bodies of cadavers, Freeman and Watts asked Alice and her husband for their consent to do this procedure. The Hamats agreed to proceed. For Alice, the operation consisted of shaving her head, drilling several, not the whole head, but like from the ear on forward, I guess. Drilling,
that's a good look.
Drilling
That's
several
a
holes.
haircut now.
Yeah. And it would be 10 years in the future. Drilling several holes in the skull, 12 holes in the skull, inserting the leucotome tool, and I think I write what that is later on, and doing one full circle with it in multiple angles inside of each hole to break up the frontal lobe tissue. So cut up the brain pretty bad. Immediately following the operation, Alice seemed great. She was in good spirits. She felt good. She didn't have any of the emotional problems she had before. She wasn't paranoid. She wasn't excited. She was calm and collected. 6 days later, Freeman found Alice was suddenly disoriented and excited. She had started stuttering. She seemed to understand what others said but couldn't find words herself. A few days after that, she was paging through magazines, could draw pictures, but she couldn't write legibly or carry on a conversation. Eventually, Alice could speak normally and walk without difficulty. When she went home, she could sleep without medication and live without a nurse's care. She had few worries, could think without distraction from anxiety, and was, quote, content to grow old gracefully, when previously one of her many worries was her getting gray hair. When Freeman and Watts, just 17 days after the surgery, recounted the details of the case to members of the District of Columbia Medical Society and indicated the operation had relieved Alice of her symptoms, the director of a nearby psych hospital, Dexter Bullard, said, "Walter, you can't say that." Others agreed. They thought the trauma of surgery might have shocked Hamat into temporary remission from her psychiatric symptoms. But months after her surgery, Alice had a convulsion, probably related to the surgery. She fell and broke her wrist. But after that, she basically continued to live with reduced anxiety and stayed out of mental hospitals. 5 years after her lobotomy, she got pneumonia and died at the age of 68. So that's the end of Alice. But for those years that she lived, it was better than it was
Yeah, it sounds like it.
before.
I don't know if she's ever had good years in her life. You know?
Yeah, so comparing it to before, maybe it's good, but not comparing it to the baseline.
Yeah.
3 weeks after Alice's psychosurgery, is what they're calling it, in September 1936, Freeman and Watts found another candidate for the leucotomy technique. A 59-year-old bookkeeper named Emma Ager suffered from agitated depression like Alice and had spent nearly 6 months in bed. She also had hallucinations and fear of being poisoned. In this procedure, the leucotome tool broke midway through, but otherwise had no complications. Didn't get stuck in her brain or anything. Emma returned to her job after a 2-month recovery and kept her bookkeeping job for 8 years before retiring. Her symptoms seemed either gone or greatly diminished after the procedure. Another patient was a 33-year-old concrete worker named Linwood Roberts. His complaints were a variety: nervousness, worry, palpitation, throbbing in the head, fear of falling, and suicidal ideation. His mother started caring for him, and eventually he was confined to bed for 18 months, most of the time with his hand on his chest waiting for his heart to stop beating. The surgery turned Linwood into a compulsive talker. Just after his operation, he surprised his doctors with continuous chatter. The hospital staff had to shush him repeatedly after other patients complained he wouldn't/couldn't shut up. 12 years later, he was still employed. Freeman wrote, he makes his home with his mother, seems to have no great ambition to get married and raise a family, but he's well thought of by his employers and has few complaints. Their 5th surgery, we're not going through every single one because there were
I was
thousands.
going to say, these are all sounding pretty good so far. I'm waiting for the bad stuff.
Yeah, their 5th surgery produced their first immediate failure.
There we go.
The 47-year-old patient had attempted suicide by inhaling gas and spent half a day unconscious. She was probably already suffering brain damage at this point. Freeman and Watts cut several blood vessels in her brain during the operation. She suffered seizures and bladder incontinence, and the surgery did not lessen her anxiety. A month after her surgery, she was still quite confused, inattentive, and forgets easily, according to Freeman's notes. It's notable that Walter Freeman was not a surgeon. He was like a neurologist, a psychiatrist, but he had no training in surgery. He really had no business performing it. But more often than not, in the OR, he took charge over Watts, who was the actual neurosurgeon. They performed their first 20 lobotomies at George Washington University Hospital, and Freeman got into trouble when Watts got sick before a surgery, and Freeman just decided to do it himself. Another actual surgeon was watching and said, absolutely not. The university and hospital said, get your surgical privileges or let the professional do the work. Freeman would never get surgical privileges without surgical training, which he didn't have, and he knew he'd be rejected if he ever made such an application for them. So, around this time, as early as October 1936, after just doing a couple of leucotomies, Freeman was trying to find a large mental hospital that would let him do this procedure on its patients. He'd hoped to begin the first large-scale series of lobotomies on the nearly limitless group of candidates at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, but the director at the mental hospital rightly questioned the ability of a mentally ill patient to completely authorize a hazardous procedure like lobotomy, and their families might have ulterior motives for allowing the surgery to get rid of the problem in their lives by making the person with mental illness more docile. He never got to do this mass procedure, though. No one in their right minds would allow him to do such a dangerous thing. World War II put a bit of a stymie on Freeman and Watts's work. They would continue to perform lobotomies, but not at the pace they had started at. Freeman wanted to find a more efficient way anyway, a way to bring the procedure out of the OR and into the hands, out of the OR in the hands of the neurosurgeon entirely. He didn't want people telling him what to do. This was tried in mental hospitals, by the way, just no one would let Freeman do it because he wasn't qualified with not being a surgeon and all. The neurosurgeon Harold Buckstein lobotomized 46 patients in 17 months starting in January 1941 at Wilmark State Hospital in Minnesota. Soon after, St. Louis City Hospital began a 3-year-long lobotomy program that, quote, treated 101 patients. Paul Schrader, a doc at the psychiatric hospital in Farmington, Missouri, did lobotomies on nearly 200 patients during the early 40s and reported about a third had been discharged as a result. Minnesota and Missouri hospitals were the exception, not the rule, though. Not many other institutions would follow suit. So, how would Freeman alter his practice, the psychosurgery, to make it available, easier, simpler, and cheaper? Freeman checked out the work of Amaro Fiamberti, who was a director of a mental hospital in Italy, who explored a seldom used surgical path to the frontal lobes, earlier pioneered by another Italian doctor, a couple of them, a way to get directly to the brain. Maurice Ducoste used it as a way to deliver malaria inoculations directly to the brain. A.M. Dogliotti used it in ventricular puncture. Anyway, Fiamberti didn't want to drill holes into the skull to do his stuff, so he took advantage of a pre-existing opening in the skull, the eye socket. And he performed about 100 lobotomies this way, injecting alcohol or formalin into brain tissue, even inserting the Moniz leucotome tool and rotating the cutting blade. But Freeman saw this as an opportunity. You don't need an OR or a neurosurgeon to do that kind of lobotomy. That could be the ticket. So his big plan was to alter the thalamus without going into what the different areas of the brain are. It's kind of underneath and behind the prefrontal lobe. So mostly leave the prefrontal lobe alone and scramble up the thalamus. Cut through it as much as you have to, the prefrontal lobe, but the real therapy, he thought, came from severing neural pathways between the thalamus and the frontal lobe. The tools he had, as he practiced on cadavers, either bent or broke when he tried to puncture the transorbital plate behind the eye socket, because it's fairly strong. He had to find something else, and he did. At home, in his kitchen drawer, he found a tool with a strong shaft and sturdy wooden handle, a standard ice pick. And the ice pick worked. When he inserted it into cadavers beneath the upper eyelid and kept the shaft parallel to the bony ridge of the nose, the pick situated itself in a way he could just lightly tap with a hammer to drive the point through the orbital plate. More importantly for Freeman, this new method was quick and didn't require an OR visit or a surgeon. He made a movie for himself in 1950 called Transorbital Lobotomy, demonstrating the procedure on a cadaver. So everybody could see this is what we're doing now. He lifts the upper eyelid of the corpse, inserts the tool into the tear duct, hits his hammer twice and breaks through the transorbital bone. He pushes it in 5 centimeters and the real magic happens. He wrote to his son Paul, the transorbital lobotomy consists of knocking them out with a shock, and while they're under the, quote, anesthetic, thrusting an ice pick up between the eyeball and the eyelid through the roof of the orbit, actually into the frontal lobe of the brain, and making the lateral cut by swinging the thing from side to side. He admitted to his son it was definitely a disagreeable thing to watch. But he'd mapped out a treatment that he could do in just 7 minutes, what the complex Freeman-Watts standard lobotomy surgery could do without hours in the OR and weeks of recovery. But he couldn't do it without putting someone under, and at state-run mental hospitals there was likely no anesthesia to use. So he would use what they had on hand, electroconvulsive therapy. These machines were in many, if not all, psychiatric hospitals at the time, and the lucky benefit of this was patients often lost their memory of the minutes right before the lobotomy. So people who watched Freeman's demonstrations and, quote, operations, this was one of the most troubling parts. Strapped to a table with protective padding between their jaws, patients went into violent convulsions when electricity passed through their brains. Most of the early transorbital lobotomies Freeman did gave folks pretty bad black eyes. Initially, he only did one eye at a time and said, "Come back a week later for the other one." He wrote, "Some of the black eyes are beauties, however, and I usually ask the family to provide the patient with sunglasses rather than explanations." The fourth
The
patient,
whole like
yeah,
ran into a doorknob situation.
yeah. The fourth patient Freeman treated this way was a man named David Berman. Freeman punctured a blood vessel in Berman's brain during the lobotomy, which resulted in seizures and an emergency trip to the hospital. The patient was permanently disabled and later could only support himself selling newspapers on a street corner. Guess whether or not Freeman kept going after that.
I would say he definitely did.
Oh,
He
yeah.
enjoys the heck out of this too.
Hell yeah.
Statistically, I mean, one person selling newspapers, to him, he's
Yeah.
doing pretty good.
Not too bad. Yeah, so you're right. Freeman wasn't discouraged. After the 10th procedure this way, his relationship with James Watts, though, would change forever. They've got a couple different versions of what happened and made their relationship fail. According to Freeman, he had told Watts about his work on cadavers and his intentions to operate on patients with an ice pick. Watts refused to be any part of that, and later Freeman invited Watts up to his office to watch the 10th lobotomy done this way and operated on both sides of the brain in the same session. Watts didn't like what he saw. He told Freeman that unless he stopped, he would look around for other offices to work at. Watts' story was a little bit darker than that. Earlier, he had asked Freeman not to do lobotomies in offices that Watts and Freeman shared. An office assistant had informed Watts of Freeman's experimental surgery, so he said, "Don't do that where we both work, you idiot." Watts walks upstairs during the 10th lobotomy and sees Freeman standing over an unconscious patient with an ice pick in his face. Freeman asked Watts to hold the ice pick while he snapped a photograph. Watts refused and protested that brain surgery should not be an office procedure. He threatened to fight against Freeman doing any lobotomies at George Washington University Hospital. That's the two different versions of the story. Either way, they had a falling out. So, shocking. So Freeman instead went to two other hospitals in the area who gave him permission to use electroshock convulsion therapy and do his lobotomies there. Freeman decided in the spring of 47 he wanted to teach psychiatrists, most of whom were not trained as surgeons, how to do this procedure. Watts left the offices he and Freeman shared after this. Watts was mostly at odds with Freeman over how and where he wanted to perform the new style. Watts himself performed 28 transorbital lobotomies between 1949 and 1956 to treat schizophrenia, psychoneurosis, obsessive tension, anxiety, and agitated depression. So it was the method and the place, not the technique itself, that Watts had a problem with. Eventually, Freeman and Watts decided to use this to relieve pain from doing lobotomy to cancer patients to even pregnant women during labor. In one case, a patient whose terminal illness had left one leg disabled, quote, no longer complained of pain when being moved and was even able to get out of bed and walk, although she complained that the affected leg was shorter than the other. Of the first 400 transorbital lobotomies Freeman performed, he reported that one patient died from hemorrhage within a day, 2 died later from bleeding in the brain, and 1 had a serious hemorrhage but survived in a state of bland indifference considerably resembling that observed after radical lobotomy. 6 others suffered seizures, weakness on one side of the body, or other complications, but fewer died or were permanently disabled than prefrontal lobotomy, drilling the holes and doing actual surgery. Freeman had some showcase patients. One was a doctor who established a 10-member medical clinic and got his pilot's license after his lobotomy. One was a symphony orchestra violinist. One was a successful psychiatrist, but they were atypical. Eventually, Freeman determined 85% of his private patients, not confined to state mental hospitals, were able to live at home, and 2/3 were usefully occupied, he called it. Of the lobotomies he did in state hospitals, 45% returned home. He described that most of these patients had the Boy Scout virtues in reverse: lack of trustworthiness, loyalty, helpfulness, friendliness, and all the rest. After the lobotomy, he had his machinist friend create a tool built from steel that was tested by inserting the point through the keyhole of a door and lifting with a force of 25 kilograms on the handle without bending or breaking the instrument. He called it the Orbitoclast and felt safe using maximum power to produce the deep frontal cut he would use on patients who didn't seem to get better after the standard lobotomy. So another lobotomy, a more intense lobotomy. And lobotomies weren't just for adults. One of the youngest patients was a 12-year-old boy. His stepmother, whose name was Lou, said Howard Dully was defiant, daydreamed, and even objected to going to bed. Lou took her stepson to several doctors who said there was nothing wrong, he's just a kid. But
Little piece of
Freeman
shit.
agreed to do the lobotomy.
Hell yeah, fuck that little kid.
Yeah. Freeman became something of a big hit in the U.S., where he toured hospitals performing the procedure and again training psychiatrists to do it too. He was a showman who invited press coverage, and many people and organizations wrote about his work. But critics of the procedure and ones like it said it did nothing more than turn people into vegetables. They might be easier to take care of now, but were they being helped or just snuffed out? In 1967, Freeman performed his last lobotomy before being banned from operating. After he performed the third lobotomy on a longtime patient of his, she developed a brain hemorrhage and died. The U.S. performed more lobotomies than any other country in this period. Sources vary on the exact number, but it's thought to be between 40 and 50,000, vast majority happening between the late 40s and early 50s. As early as the 1950s, some nations, including Germany and Japan, had outlawed lobotomies. So, some of the stuff that happened to the lobotomy patients, a small percentage of people supposedly got better or stayed the same, but lobotomy had negative lasting effects on most everybody else. They lost their inhibitions, their initiative, they lost empathy, and some, maybe many, lost ability to function on their own. Dr. Baron Lerner, a medical historian and professor at NYU Medical Center in New York, says the main long-term side effect was mental dullness. Some people couldn't live independently anymore. They lost their personalities. Mental institutions played a huge role here. There were, again, hundreds of thousands of institutions, and they were overcrowded and chaotic. If you gave patients who were too unruly a lobotomy, you can control the asylum population. I didn't see the movie, but the 1975 film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Randall Patrick Murphy is a rambunctious but sane man living at a mental hospital who's given a lobotomy that leaves him mute and vacant-minded. Dr. Lerner said, usually things in movies are exaggerated, but in this case, it was disturbingly real. Henry Marsh worked as a psychiatric nurse in a long-term nursing facility who used to see former lobotomy patients. They'd been lobotomized 30 to 40 years ago. They were chronic schizophrenics, and they were often the ones who were some of the most apathetic, slow, and knocked off. Not sure what he meant by the last part. He's now one of Britain's most eminent neurosurgeons and says the operation was just bad science. It reflected very bad medicine, bad science, because it was clear the patients who were subjected to the procedure were never followed up properly. If you saw the patient after the operation, they'd seem all right. They'd walk and talk and say, "Thank you, doctor." The fact they were totally ruined as social human beings probably didn't count. The lobotomy had a slow and sequential rise, but the downfall happened all at once. Chlorpromazine was developed, and the lobotomy was depopularized. Chlorpromazine was the first psychotherapeutic drug approved to treat schizophrenia with positive effect. During its first year on the market, it was administered to around 2 million patients. Today, we don't really see lobotomies performed, which is a good thing. In the mid-50s, scientists developed antipsychotic drugs and antidepressants, which were much more effective than shoving an ice pick into someone's brain and scrambling it up. Mental illness is largely treated with drugs these days. As we know, there's sometimes chemical imbalances in the brain that make up some of mental illness and can treat it with some success. Psychosurgery might happen today, but it's not shoving an ice pick into an eye socket. It's removing specific brain areas and only using patients for whom all other treatments have failed. There's one where they, like in people who have grand mal seizures, they'll separate the lobes, the left and right hemispheres of the brain, to make it impossible for a grand mal seizure to happen. I haven't read that they do that very often, but in extreme cases they do if people the drugs aren't working and they can't stop having seizures. What were you going to say, Jay?
I was just going to say that the medicine, while more effective, is not nearly as fun as blasting someone's skull open with an ice pick.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's for me, it makes me wonder what in 70 years what medicine's going to think of things that we do now. Like what things that we're doing now are they going to be like, what the fuck were you thinking? Like why would you pour radiation chemicals into someone's body to treat cancer even though it works?
Opioids.
Yeah.
Yeah, seriously, I'm sure that's what it's going to be. Now, would you consider this guy as evil, or because like in reading or listening to all of this, it really feels like other than his insistence in wanting to do it himself, he seems to have meant well.
It
Like
depends on.
it sounds like he at least thought that he was actually helping someone.
Yeah, it depends on who you ask. Lobotomizing a 12-year-old kid who's just rambunctious isn't ideal.
No,
Um,
no, not at all.
if he thought that it was helping people, he should have done better follow-up care to see if it actually helped them. Some of them he did find, like he kept notes of 12 years later, they're still doing this, or they died of seizures, possibly related to the lobotomy, but there wasn't a ton of that. He did more
Right.
than others did, but I don't know. It's hard to say because it depends on who. To me, it depends on who wants the lobotomy to happen. If it's the person with the mental illness or their relative who doesn't want to deal with this person anymore, it's just hard to say. I don't know that he necessarily was intending to be evil or do something barbaric and awful, but the net result for me is the same.
I think
Yeah.
he was a narcissist who was more involved in creating something that he could put his name on than he was the actual outcomes.
Right. I guess like, who knows if, just like you said, in the future they're going to look back and say things like opioids, and obviously that's a clear one, but maybe some other procedures were absolutely insane and people are going to be seen as barbaric for doing that kind of thing. But I also wouldn't be surprised if, say, 100 years in the future, they do find that there's some way to properly lobotomize, and lobotomy not taking like huge portions out, but like you said, Mark, people who are on their last leg, they have no other procedure. Maybe there's a chance that they could be saved with a procedure like this. Who knows if in the future they can get so precise that they can actually do stuff like that. And then it gets into some crazy sci-fi stuff as to whether, like you said, if it's going to
Black
be
Mirror.
the choice of, yeah, like is it going to be the choice of the parents when the baby's first born, kind of like DNA editing, where they're like, okay, your child's going to have this mental disorder, but if we operate on their brain right now, they're no longer going to be rambunctious.
My guess is it'll be less of a surgery and we'll probably just evolve into microchipping brains.
Yeah,
Yeah.
something that just automatically knows what to fix.
Get him, Elon Musk.
Yeah, what's the kid's name? Like,
Oh, I don't
Delta
know.
12 something.
Yeah, I don't know
I
what
don't know.
he tried to name his child. So there you have it.
It is best for a robot.
You heard it here first, not first, but you heard it here. Lobotomy, not a great tool, and not used
That would be
anymore.
really bad if they heard it here first. Like, like some guy in a country, listens to this and he's like, "Oh my gosh, lobotomies are bad. I've been doing them for the past 30 years."
Turns out scrambling up brains isn't the best necessarily method to treat mental illness. So now you know. You
Nope.
heard it here first. Don't scramble up your brains, and you'll be
Don't
better.
do drugs, kids.
You can visit us at halfwaynetwork.com, though. Some of us are only represented by our cartoon drawings of our faces.
That's most of us, right?
No. Anyway, see you next time.
Now I have to go and research.
What are you researching?
See if